Okay, we'll go ahead and get back at it. Sorry about that. Okay, so again, we looked at one side of the extreme, competition, and now we're looking at monopolies. Okay, now the question becomes, what is a monopoly and how do monopolies arise? Okay, basically you can define a monopoly because it meets two requirements, right? Number one, whatever it produces, goods or services, that monopoly has no, again, that good and that service, no close substitutes. There's nothing close. Right? There's just nothing close. So if you can, again, we're borrowing a lot from Greg Mankiw again, but if you think about it, you know, if you want Microsoft Office, there's only one place to get it. And by the way, Microsoft Office dominates just about everything. I mean, at the higher ed level, we teach entire courses based on just that, right? Just on the Microsoft Office package, okay? And number two, and probably more importantly, this monopoly is the sole provider of that good or service, right? So again, they're the only one in town, right? The only provider, if you will. And there are no close substitutes to that good or service. Now, again, we had talked just a couple seconds ago about Microsoft Office. I mean, there really are no close substitutes. I mean, everybody uses Microsoft Office, okay? Now, again, separate that. Again, and this is true of the point being, I should catch myself up here for a second. You see a lot of this in terms of software, technology, things like that. Microsoft Office just being a really good example. I mean, everybody uses Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, things like that. Everybody's got a PowerPoint slide. To the point where, you know, in regard to intellectual property, it's almost impossible to trademark PowerPoint because it's almost become generic, even if you had another software package that could produce that. But the other thing is that, you know, or looking at it from a different place where you see competition, maybe a little bit more competition, there are a few other, right, methods for using spreadsheets and things like that, but so versus Excel, not many of them are really not really viable. I mean, it's kind of funny in the sense that, you know, Microsoft, the Excel package is so dominant, and it doesn't necessarily work well with other spreadsheet programs that they've kind of closed them out. So either you use something different from Excel and that's the only thing you're going to use, or you just use Excel, but never shall the two meet, I guess. It's probably another, and browsers would probably be another example. There's Google, there's Internet Explorer, Mozilla, perhaps. Then you really only get three, so it's almost an oligopoly. So kind of a long-winded point there, I guess. Okay, now, let's talk about how they're created. So we know what they are, right? They're the only provider, the only group in town that does this, so to speak. And when I say that, it's just kind of an old saying. So, you know, there may be, you know, there are no others in the market, if you will. Okay, so not just in town, but in the market. Okay, and then of course there are no close goods or substitutes. Okay, so how do they get there? All right, there are several possibilities, all right, of which we're only going to look at 4. Okay, so any one of these 4 might be enough, right? And there are some circumstances where it's all 4. Okay, so number 1, it's basically cost structure. Right? That no other firm can compete in the market because of cost structure, right? That a firm is so efficient, so powerful, they're able to drive their costs down so low, right? Nobody else can compete, okay? Now, again, those firms are fewer and fewer, right? Natural resources, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit separately. But when you think about the ability to control costs, it's not just natural resources, it's labor, it's transportation, it's all sorts of things. It's not just the stuff that you need to make the other stuff, okay? All right. The second is those natural resources. Many firms that consider themselves monopolies or are monopolies in the marketplace, they actually control the natural resources as well. Now, they probably don't control labor and they don't control transportation, although they might have a little bit more control in regard to transportation. In other words, they may have their own shipping fleet and they're able to drive down costs that way. You think about software companies, you know, it doesn't take much to transfer software. So, software would be more of certainly a human capital type of issue. Okay. All right, next. All right, so number 3 on our list. Essentially, the government won't enforce what we generally call antitrust laws. So again, antitrust laws are designed to break up monopolies, and there are some governments that simply will not enforce antitrust laws. All right, our antitrust law here in the United States tends to be a very politically driven body of law. It really depends on who's in the White House. Sometimes they'll enforce it, sometimes they won't. It can be very controversial. Sometimes the enforcement of antitrust law doesn't always make political sense. It makes legal sense, sometimes vice versa. Okay. All right, and then lastly, all right, so again, in addition to the antitrust costs and natural resources control issues, the government actually sets it up that way. All right, so if you think about it, there are some crown corporations, government-owned corporations, whereby the government said this is going to be a monopoly, and that's just how we're going to do it. All right? Probably the classic example in the United States, only the U.S. Postal Service has the ability to deliver first-class mail. They have a monopoly on first-class mail. Other examples at the local government level, utilities, right? Water, gas, in some places, cable television, not so much in the Midwest and the East Side, but nonetheless. Okay, now with that said, all right, when you think about how monopolies come to be, if you had to pick one of these 4, right, issues that we've talked about, it's probably cost structure. All right. Some firms are just so powerful and they're so able to drive down their costs. Again, even when you're enforcing antitrust law, nobody's really in control of the natural resources. Government maybe hasn't created it. It's really the ability to control cost. Okay. Now, when you think about what we sometimes call natural monopolies are those firms that actually can do just that. They can control costs better than any 2 or more firms, right? So if you think about anybody trying to compete, they can't do it because they just can't drive their costs down, whether it be human cost of natural resources, transportation, shipping, all that kind of issues. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how monopolies can really control, or how they make production and pricing decisions. Okay, now when you think about a monopoly's pricing decision, you go back to that original formula we were looking at. Okay, and again, we were looking at it in terms of competition first, and so we'll just, whoops. Total revenue equals P times Q, right? Price times quantity. Okay. Now, when we were looking at competition, we were looking at milk, right? Everybody's producing milk, lots of distributors, warehousers, lots of cows out there, farmland, things like that. Really wasn't that big a deal. Remember, the only flexibility you had really was with quantity. You were price takers. Things are a little bit different when it comes to monopolies. Monopolies are price givers, right? They set the price. They'll tell you what it is, okay? So if nothing else, we can at least say the following, right? If the price goes up, we know for sure, right, total revenue for that particular firm, because we're not talking about the entire industry anymore, right? We're talking about that particular firm. Okay, so if price goes up, we know that total revenue is going to go up one way or the other. Okay, now with that said, they can also dictate quantity, okay? So we're doing something we haven't quite done, all right? Now, they can control quantity, all right? They can decide how much. Now, they still, however, have to what? Again, we're just talking about pricing decisions, right? How monopolies make pricing decisions. They still have to watch a little bit, all right, about quantity, because even with a monopoly, right, they know there's a finite consumer base, right, and you might not want to have too many units out there because it will actually have an effect on your price a little bit, but for the most part, on average, ceteris paribus, right, if they increase quantity, they can increase total revenue as well. So what I want to do is kind of just graphically, so I'm going to have to get this, but just so you can kind of work with it mentally as we go through this. We're going to put up two two graphs here. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. All right, and same price and quantity. All right, price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. Okay, and all right. Okay, so now these are demand curves, right? And for a competitive market, basically it's going to look like this. And for a, in fact, I'm going to give you, we'll go ahead and do it once I got the, all right. You know it's at least going to be somewhat, this is elastic, this is going to be somewhat more inelastic, but there's always a pull, right, to the point where it becomes inelastic, because monopolies can only really operate if they have something that's much closer to an inelastic, right, inelastic demand. Now think about it, if it were elastic, that would mean there would have to be substitutes out there, right? For whatever that monopoly's good or service is, they would certainly, you know, admittedly, they wouldn't be a monopoly, right? But nonetheless, if it was elastic, there would be some goods and services where a consumer can say, okay, that's too expensive, I'm going to go here, right? Okay, so it's going to be at least something like that, but there's always some pressure to make it more inelastic. So at least starts here and then kind of gets a little bit more vertical, if you will. Okay? All right. Now, regardless, by the way, I mean, monopolies aren't different than competitive firms, at least in regard to the fact that they're going to try to find that sweet spot on that demand curve when they set the price. All right? So, again, it's not something you can completely forget about there. Okay. All right. Now, just a couple things that I want to add here to this particular section. Okay. Now, when we come back on, I guess when we come back on Monday, we'll talk a little bit about. To back up a little bit, we're going to put this into practice. Okay, and we're also going to talk a little bit about. We'll use an example. We're going to talk about finding this sweet spot, and it's going to be, the inference is going to be just a little bit different in the sense that when we look at competitive firms, we're looking at marginal cost basically being price, right? Average cost. Again, everything was pretty much the same, not average cost. Again, price and marginal cost, we had created this price line that kind of mirrors everything, right? Okay. Now, what we're going to do when we come back on Monday is we're going to look at it just a little bit differently, and we're going to see how marginal cost, right, might actually be lower than price, okay? All right, so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about, all right, monopoly revenue here, and again, I'm just going to barely introduce it because I don't want to go too much, so I want to be able to work through the chart on Monday with you in class. Okay, now you kind of see this. All right, let's go back to the equation, the revenue equation. Okay. All right. Okay, and I think I was using blue for price. Okay, and we'll bring in, I think I was using light brown for quantity. We'll throw that in here in a sense. Okay, now, what we knew, just to kind of come back, and again, we're still kind of ebbing and flowing between comparing monopolies to competitive firms. Okay, but again, when it comes to competitive firms, remember, the only thing they could really adjust was quantity. And we've already mentioned that firms that are monopolies can actually adjust both. But what I want to do is put labels on these, all right? So essentially, all right, let me use black here. All right, there are two effects. The first is a price effect, right, which we've already identified, okay? But I'm going to say a couple of things, okay? All right, number one, as price goes up, total revenue is going to go up, okay? You already know that. But the other thing, all right, that I want to mention, right, that as price goes up, profit should also go up, right? Because if you're a monopoly, your cost should stay the same, okay? Now, we'll put now you're probably thinking, like, well, wait a minute, I remember you drawing that average total, that average variable cost that kind of pulls up your average total cost over time, okay? But the real effect is much more subtle, right? So when we first started looking at, we had an average total cost curve, an average variable cost curve, right? And an average total cost curve, right? You might think, well, wait a minute, that average variable cost started pulling things up after a while when we saw an increase in production, okay? However, again, it's a little bit more subtle here. Your profit should increase if you're a monopoly, all right? Again, go back to what we just talked about a little while ago. The number one reason as to why firms wind up as monopolies, okay, is the fact that they can control those costs. Okay, now the second, I kind of gave this one away a little bit ago, but is the output effect. Whoops. Okay, now with the output effect, I think I had this in brown, so I'll go back to brown. Probably looks like black maybe on the camera. Okay, but as quantity goes up, total revenue should go up. And again, just kind of like we have the price effect, the arrows kind of give that away. But the other thing should be the case too, right? Much more subtle with a monopoly, right? But as quantity goes up, excuse me, your profit increases as well. Okay, so that's what I want you to see. All right, again, in fact, let's just go ahead and do that. I know it's a little overkill. All right, I'll just go ahead and, all right, and maybe we'll just use, right, remember this, and maybe we'll go, and average total cost there. Okay, so again, if this was production and this were cost, in fact, we'll just go ahead and put those on here. All right, cost. This is quantity produced. I know this is really overkill, but I just want you to see it. Okay, so essentially, again, as the average variable cost increases, again, with greater production, all right, you see that U shape. We talked about that several times. It's going to pull up, right, average total costs a little bit. And again, I could have made this a little bit more pronounced. Your average fixed cost will go down. Okay, but essentially, all right, if you've got a monopoly and you're able to control costs, all right, this will be, and I tried to make it a little bit more subtle, these are going to kind of move down a little bit, right? I know I'm kind of interfering with the graph a little bit, but they're going to be pulled down a little bit. Okay, so again, the number one reason as to why these firms are monopolies is they're able to control those prices, right? And again, they're able to control cost. And again, if they're able to pull these costs down, all right, and by the way, this thing will just go, keep going straight down, all right? The price effect and the output effect are much greater, and I've kind of shown you that with the arrows there, okay? Now, again, just to kind of recap, the chief difference, right, between a monopoly and a competitive firm, right, or a firm in a competitive market rather, right, is that a firm in a competitive market, they take the price. Whatever the price is, that's it. Remember, way too many buyers, way too many sellers for any one to actually make a difference, okay? Here, with a monopoly, you've got one provider, all right, the only game in town, so to speak, to use the phrase again, all right, and there are no close substitutes. So, yeah, there's going to be a price effect for sure. Now, whether it's a monopolistic condition or a competitive condition, they'll both have the ability to move quantity a little bit. Okay, but the other thing I want you to see, the other key difference here is that when it comes to monopoly firms, this should hold true and this should hold true. Now, that's not necessarily the case with a competitive environment. All right, with a competitive, in fact, let's just go ahead and do this for overkill. With a competitive environment, those things aren't going to be true. It just happens to be the case with a monopolistic firm. Okay. All right, now, what we're going to do is we're going to stop here. That's a pretty good place to break, because when we come back on Monday, I want to be able to go through the table, and I think it's just more important that I have that in class with you. Okay, so hopefully you can get to see this either tomorrow, which will be Friday, or over the weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. All right, see you then.